Actually, I started off as a investigative journalist. I studied journalism for my bachelor's. At the time, I also took some courses in Korean studies, Japan studies. So that was kind of an interesting combination. But yeah, I did an internship at a newspaper. I'm from the Netherlands, so that's where I did my internship. And I quickly found that I really like to dig into things and try to solve puzzles. So before focusing on North Korean human rights, I just reported on human rights related issues in general as a freelancer mostly. And this was for stories for The Guardian and The Observer, and as well as some Dutch media. And again, not at all North Korea related. Some stories, for example, one story I wrote was about forced labor migration route from Vietnam to the UK. So how migrants traveled from Vietnam all the way to Romania through some kind of legal loophole to make their way to the UK. That's the kind of story that you really need to deploy some investigative techniques to get to the core of what's going on. Yeah, that's eventually what also got me onto a story from The Guardian. This was COVID, 2020, and I was asked to help on an investigation onto how the UK government sourced their protective gear at the time. And we found that actually a lot of the protective gear, these white suits that medical personnel were wearing, came from a region in China where they use a lot of North Korean labor. So that was my first big story that was North Korea related and also human rights related because we found that there was forced labor involved. That's a bit of an overview of how I got to work on this. I was just talking about how we cannot enter the country. So one of the things that we do regularly is we use satellite imagery to see what's changing on the ground. And that helps because there are several providers that provide satellite imagery on a regular basis. A famous one is Google Earth. They do a very good job, but the interval is very wide. So you'll have one picture each year, for example, of a certain region. So we also rely on other providers that give day-to-day satellite imagery. And then it, of course, depends on weather. If it's cloudy, you can't see anything. But when it comes to human rights, it helps to see what's going on and what's changing for the people on the ground in North Korea. So to give you an example, this is a story I did together with Jacob Bogle. He specializes in satellite imagery analysis. And one big human rights story is that it's getting harder and harder for people to escape the country, right, to defect. So Jacob found, and I helped him with that, that we knew already that North Korea was strengthening the border with China, which is the most common defection route, right? But it turned out that since the pandemic, North Korea has added hundreds of miles of fencing also along the coastline. And that's something that you can see. It's very hard to see perhaps, but we found that very remote areas were getting developed. So here there's no fence, and here they've added a fence and new guard posts. This is roughly how a fence looks like. This is a bit more of the old-fashioned ones. The upper part is usually electrified, and it really takes a lot of time to look at these images and kind of understand what you're looking at. And what you're looking for is changes on the ground. So here's a bit more clear. I'm not sure if this is if you can see this well, but on the left side, you see an image before 2023, and on the right side, is the new situation on the ground. And what we do is we check what's changing. So here you can see that along this area, there's no fence and access to sea is free. And then suddenly we see this along the yellow line, a huge fence being built, right? Which will make it harder, especially South Hwanghae, there we've seen some defections there for people to get access to the sea and try to escape from there. So that's one way that one technique we use, right? And we don't only do this with fences. You can also look at prison camps to see how prison camps are changing. And that's one of the things that I follow very closely, and one of the things that I'll have a new story out on soon, because and it's not just to see what's changing, but it's also to show our readers that this is still ongoing, right? If you have a prison camp where buildings are being added all the time, it shows that the prison camp is still in operation. So it doesn't only show what's changing, it also shows the fact that it's still in use. That's one way that we work with. And then another way is very straightforward: state media. So North Korea has a huge amount of newspapers. They produce a lot of TV, radio, and monitoring that. A lot of it is extremely boring, but a lot of it, but that's why you have to look at it a lot to see what stands out. So this is a story. North Korean TV profiled a high school student working to repay Kim Jong-un's love on a construction site. I mean, you can write like 1,000 words about it, but it's very simple. It's a miner doing hard labor, and in many countries that is considered illegal. So sometimes North Korea is just very open with any kinds of abuse, and it became even more clear in stories like these when state media reports on teenagers who die from overwork. So the point I'm trying to make is you don't always have to look very far to cover human rights in North Korea. So it's very important to keep monitoring state media and have a very holistic approach to getting information from North Korea. So don't think too complicated. Also simply look at what North Korea is saying, what it is publishing, because sometimes there will be a lot of information in that. Another way that I try to get information from North Korea is, now that the borders are slowly opening, for now, Russian tourists are one of the few who are allowed to enter the country. And some of these Russian tourists, they upload hours-long footage on YouTube, unedited, just simply them having a GoPro with them and uploading like 2 hours of walking or 2 hours of traveling in a bus from one tourism spot to another. That helped me to draft this story about the countryside, North Korean countryside. For years, North Korea has been closed, and these are one of the first images that we now have of the current situation in remote areas, so areas far away from Pyongyang. So in this case, this Russian tourist was able to film a lot on his bus ride from the beach to a little resort in the mountains. And that helps us to understand the situation on the ground. How are people living? Are there any changes? Well, you can see that still the situation in rural North Korea is very old-fashioned. People using carts and oxes and barely any cars. Here you can see a lady washing clothes in the river, but also some new developments. For example, the introduction of e-bikes, electric bikes, probably from China. That's something we didn't really know yet, that those are reaching on the countryside. So again, this is all publicly available information. And then I would say one other thing is to regularly visit the border. That's very important to keep in touch with what we're doing and to see what's changing. We're in South Korea, and North Korea is very close. So sometimes it helps to just simply go to the border, see what's happening, see if you can see anything. And then lastly, and this is probably one of the most important sources for me, is North Korean escapees living in South Korea. They often still have active connections to North Korea. They contact people there, some of them, but even if they don't, they have incredible stories to tell usually, that symbolize a lot about what's going on in North Korea. In this case, I documented a family who makes a living diving along the East Coast here in South Korea, in the northernmost port. So this is basically the furthest port closest to North Korea where you're allowed to do fishing. And that's where they settled, ironically, and make a living from diving for all kinds of seafood. So yeah, those stories are always the most interesting, talking to people. And even though we cannot visit North Korea, we can still visit and talk to a lot of people from North Korea. So I think that's probably my most important source for stories. One of the big trends right now that's been going on since 2022 is North Korea's increasing cooperation with Russia, relying less and less on China for its economic aid and also trade, and more on Russia. That has huge implications for human rights. Of course, we know about North Korean soldiers who fight in Russia and for Russia. And then, of course, we have a huge arms trade happening between the two countries, right? And we are not entirely sure yet what North Korea is getting in return, though already from 2022, I could see from publicly available trade data that Russia was shipping a lot of grains to North Korea more than before. Wheat, corn, those kind of things. So I think that's a very major trend that everyone's watching who's anything on North Korea, because it has huge implications also for other parts of the world. Usually North Korea stories are quite local in the sense that it affects the region, China, South Korea, Japan. But now we see that North Korea stories are reaching Europe. Another big trend I am watching is North Korea is getting increasingly comfortable with basically revealing more of its restrictive regime. So at the UN, North Korean diplomats are becoming more defensive over its rights violations and also publicly admit at times that they're executing people. Right? We saw that recently, and that's quite worrisome. And that relates also to increasing crackdowns on information. North Korea is actively every year updating its law with new rules that stipulate punishments for accessing all kinds of information from abroad, but also, for example, using what's deemed as non-North Korean speech, so any kind of slang coming out of South Korea, for example. So I think those are the main trends that I'm watching right now. I don't think there's any other job that allows me to, if I have some kind of interest or some kind of question, to just basically spend a couple days calling up people and asking them all kinds of questions about that, and people don't find it strange. So that's what keeps me going. I don't have like a one deep interest. I have a lot of interest, and when I'm curious about something, I wanna understand it right away. Journalism is quick paced. It's different from academia. Every day is different. So that's what keeps me addicted to the job basically. And then more intrinsically, I think why I'm drawn to investigative journalism and why I was put on the human rights beat at NK News is because I do have a very strong sense of justice, and I think we also owe it to the people in North Korea to let the regime know that people are watching what's going on. So yeah, that is also one of the things that really motivates me to do a good job at this, basically.